this last section, we're going to talk about the continued Roman expansion to the east, as well as some developments in the west. We left off part 3. We were talking about the Second Macedonian War and the problems that Rome was encountering there as they tried to stop Philip V of Macedon from taking over large swaths of territory and their allies. And the last point was that the Romans had said that they were really interested in freedom and self-determination for the Greeks. At the same time, basically, the Romans moved even further east into Antiochus and the far end of the Seleucid Empire there. And basically, what happened was sort of a continuation of their policies with Philip the Fifth. So Antiochus III was the ruler of the Seleucid Empire, and he had actually allied with one of the breakaway Greek leagues known as the Aetolian League, fighting against Rome for about 3 years or so. And the reason to point this one out is that this is even further afield than the Romans had ever gone, even in Greece. Greece is their neighbors, but Antiochus and the Seleucid Empire is past the Levant, so it's past the areas of modern-day Syria, well past Turkey and Syria, and into modern-day Iran and Iraq. So it's a vast empire, but it also served as a buffer against the even further empires even further east, which were the Parthians, for example. Basically, what happened is, over the course of these several years, the Romans were able to not only crush the Aetolians, but also crush Antiochus, even though his empire was massive. And so, with the Treaty of Apamea in 188, the Romans essentially imposed the highest indemnity that they had ever imposed on a vanquished foe. And so, for the Seleucids, their indemnity was 15,000 talents. Remember, before we talked about in the First Punic War, 3,200 talents had been $4.76 billion. If my math is correct, then 15,000 talents would be approximately $24 billion, which, although those numbers get moved around in budgets a lot today, for an ancient society, it was an insane amount of money. Almost, quite literally, unbelievable. In fact, it had the effect of bankrupting the Seleucid Empire and destroying it. That was the end of the Seleucid Empire. It collapsed shortly thereafter, even though that wasn't directly Rome's purpose. They thought it was rich enough to handle this. And this is going to have repercussions later because it's going to allow for the rise of the Parthians, who are definitely going to threaten the Romans. So after the defeat of Antiochus, as you can sort of see from this here, the Romans had a large territory that was theirs to hold. This actually doesn't show the far extent of the Seleucid Empire, which on your map here would be Asia Minor, parts of Asia Minor and Syria that came under their control after these big battles. What happens next is a continuation of their same policies when they have more problems with the Macedonians. But this is just sort of a constant refrain. But it's important to keep in mind that Rome has gone through a series of stages over several decades, with the First Macedonian War being in 211, Second Macedonian War being shortly after that, and now here we have the Third Macedonian War in 170. So we're about a half a century later, and Rome's still dealing with them, and they haven't actually crushed the Macedonians yet. The Greeks were in massive disorder at this time, and Macedonia was trying to take advantage of that. Likewise, senators in Rome were a bit ambitious and seeing how lucrative warfare was, either for some of their allies' businesses in supplying weapons and other supplies for the military, but also just in terms of money to be made on these military adventures. And so essentially what happens is Rome is victorious at the end of the Third Macedonian War, which seems to be typical. And rather than leaving it in as one unit, they divided into four autonomous republics that have to use their foreign policy and go through Rome. So essentially dividing up into four smaller units to control it. That results in making each of these republics pay a yearly tribute to the Roman treasury to the effect of 100 talents, which basically is still a lot of money. Remember, one talent is like $1.5 million. So we're still dealing with vast sums, nothing as big as what the Seleucids had to pay. But what happens is that there's a incredible tax effect from this. Because of the money coming in from all of Rome's conquest, but especially from here, Romans stopped paying taxes. They don't need, it'd be like us losing all income taxes and sale taxes. You just don't need to pay it because so much money is coming in. So obviously Romans are pleased with this of all levels. At the same time, the area in Greece known as Epirus saw the Romans essentially move in without any provocation and lay waste to the territory for almost no reason. They destroyed 70 towns. They enslaved about 150,000 people, and they ended up destroying any anti-Roman democracies that had been set up or other governments, and instead placed tyrants or other oligarchs that were favorable to Rome in their stead. And not just in Epirus, all throughout. With Epirus, though, especially, the money that came from the deportations and the sale of slaves went directly to the general, Lucius Aemilius Paulus, and his troops. And you've read a selection about the triumphs that are held, which we're going to talk about next week, which are connected to this. This is another aspect of sort of the glory that Roman generals get, but it does increase the warfare and the destruction that takes place. We now come to the Fourth Macedonian War. Notice we have almost another 20 years before this one breaks out. We're still not dealing with Philip the Fifth here. He's gone. And basically what happens is the Romans are finally fed up with Macedonia being a problem and thorn in their side. You can see that it only lasts for a year. And in the end, Rome essentially absorbs Macedonia and turns it into its own province, which means it has no independent control. You put a governor in place of that. At the same time, just about 2 years later, the Achaeans revolt, and these are in central Greece. The Achaean League and others revolt, rise up against Rome, and the Romans decide to punish them in the most severe way possible. And that is, they take the city of Corinth, which had recently joined the Achaeans, and they destroy it. They loot it for all of its wealth, and then they enslave a vast majority of the population that they haven't killed, and then they destroy the city. And this is one of the oldest and most famous Greek cities, after places like Athens, for example. Corinth had been sort of a jewel of the Greeks, and now it's gone. The Romans completely wipe it out. Interestingly enough, as we'll see, 146 is also the year of the destruction of another city, which we'll get to in just a moment. If we jump all the way back to Carthage, then what we see there in the same period is Rome drumming up war with Carthage for a third time. But you'll notice in terms of the dates here, what happens is that this is approximately 50 years after Carthage has been defeated, which is exactly the amount of time in which the Carthaginians had to pay back their massive indemnity that they owed the Romans. Interestingly enough, what had happened earlier is that the Carthaginians, within about 5 to 10 years after the defeat of Hannibal, under Hannibal had become commercially successful. They weren't belligerent or much focused on military, but they'd become so successful that they offered to pay the entire war debt to the Romans. And the Romans refused. They didn't allow them to do that because they wanted Carthaginians to remember every single year that they owed that $15 billion indemnity to them, and they didn't want them to forget about it. So rather than let them pay once, they let them pay every single year as a reminder that they were beaten. Add to that individuals like you see on the side here, Cato. Cato would put forth or embodied this notion of what's known as the metus punicus. This is the Carthaginian fear, the fear of Carthage, this fear that Carthage was resurgent. Hannibal's long dead, by the way. He's been dead for 20, 30 years by this point. But Cato hates Carthage, even though they've not fought Carthage for over half a century, and he was never around to see it in the first place. What happens is that ultimately, Cato, every time that he gives a speech in the Roman Senate, always ends his sentences with Carthago delenda est, which means Carthage must be destroyed. Doesn't matter what he's talking about. He could be talking about increasing the grain supply. He could be talking about reducing taxes. And at the end of a long speech, he'll stop, look at the senators, and say, Carthago delenda est. Carthage must be destroyed. And in fact, one day he came back from a visit to Carthage and showed up in the Senate with his toga rolled up, and as he approached them, talking about the dangers of Carthage, he opened up his toga, and these really big ripe figs fell out onto the floor as he was trying to use them as a sign of how wealthy and prosperous Carthage was. And he pointed out, these figs are still fresh after his journey from Carthage, meaning Carthage is that close. So this is all part of him drumming up fear against them. So basically, the Romans, as you've read about in your readings and the textbook, have realized that the Romans sort of concocted a war against Carthage. And in so doing, they offered Carthaginians terms, which was to abandon their city, relocate 10 miles inland, give up all merchant activity, and continue to pay Rome an indemnity. The Carthaginians, of course, refused to give up their city, and thus began sort of a long, that 149 to 146 is essentially a 3-year siege of the city, which ended ultimately when Scipio Aemilianus decided to move in and destroy Carthage through siege warfare. This is also the same, one of the same individual, or this is the same year, I should point out, that Corinth is destroyed. So in 2 years, 2 major cities are destroyed, leaving Rome completely in charge. You've read some selections about the destruction of Carthage, which we'll talk about briefly next week. But tens of thousands of people were killed, 50,000 were enslaved, and at the end of all of that, the Romans decided to tear down the walls, turn the stones over into the earth, and salt the land for 10 miles in every direction so that nothing would ever grow there again. With those 2 cities out of the way, Rome sort of unofficially renamed the Mediterranean as Mare Nostrum, our sea, which is rather arrogant of them, but gives you a sense of just how much they've changed in several hundred years. All right, the final section is to look back at Spain to give you an example of what's happening exactly at the same time, very, very briefly. A couple quick points about Spain. The Romans had obviously expanded there under the Scipios after the fall of Carthage, and it was very appealing because it was vast amounts of land, lots of people, lots of resources, but it was also very different from the east. The Romans had to deal with the Spanish, essentially town by town, tribe by tribe, because there were no vast sort of empires or even large kingdoms, and so that meant they had to essentially conquer one place and you have to move on to the next one, and the next one made it rather difficult. The Romans also established annual governorships over Spain, but this created some problems because you have a governor that's there essentially for a year, and by this point, many of the governors of the provinces simply used the provinces as a way to get rich. So basically, they had 1 year in which to extract their taxes and then all of their profits, which led to massive amounts of corruption and the fleecing of the populace as well. That led to political competition and jealousy between Romans, which was not a good thing. So they were competing to see who could get to Spain or keep people out of Spain. Because so many conquests were taking place and the Senate wanted to stop individuals from gaining so much glory, they issued new triumph guidelines that basically said you had to kill a minimum of 5,000 of the enemy, and you had to completely defeat them, utterly defeat them. These triumph guidelines for generals who wanted to have triumphs ultimately led to massacres, vast massacres, in order to gain more glory for Rome. The Romans were also pretty deceitful during this period as well. To give you a sense of how this happened, basically, remember the Romans really treasured the idea of fides, but they didn't really follow through with it here in Spain. Viriathus was a Spanish rebel fighting against the Romans, who fought against them for about 8 years in a guerrilla warfare, and he was very successful. Ultimately, he captured a Roman army, 50,000 Roman troops. This is going to be in the video that you see on Thursday, or you watch for Thursday. But he captured 50,000 Roman troops and ended up, the Romans bartered with him and made a treaty. They went back to Rome, and the Senate repudiated that treaty and instead sent assassins in to slit Viriathus' throat in 141. Meanwhile, one of the cities that was holding out was the city of Numantia. In 137, Publius Cornelius Scipio Aemilianus, the one who was involved with the destruction of Carthage, ended up doing the same thing to Numantia, killing thousands, enslaving thousands more, and destroying the city. And so these things should give you a sense of just how much Rome changed from its earlier dealings with its allies in Italy to this vast expansion and conquest of the Mediterranean. It is 400 years later, but it should show some pretty stark contrast. All right, this is the last section then before we come back next week.